Guten Abend, good evening. Many of you already know me. I'm Susan Isaacs. I'm married to Nigel, a cousin of Tony Haas. On behalf of Tony's wife Trish, our beloved Trisha, her family and friends, I would like to welcome you to the Myers Hall of the Wellington Jewish Community Centre to launch the book, Ludwig Haas, a German Jew and fighter for democracy. Needless to say, I don't even have a copy in my hand. I'm sorry, I need to get one. We would like to first welcome Rabbi Tal, Rabbi of this Wellington congregation. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for helping us so much. We're delighted that Tricia could travel to Wellington for this event. We welcome many family and friends, and in particular Criggy Haas. Criggy, one wave, with her family. Criggy's the middle daughter of Lindsay and Maggie Haas, and is the great-granddaughter of Ludwig Haas. We're videoing this evening's event so that Criggy's sisters Josephine, based in London, and Rachel, based in Whakatane, can also share in tonight's proceedings. We are honoured to have the Ambassador of Germany, Ambassador Biography, who will address you shortly. And above all, we welcome all those who have been closely associated with the development of this book. The translators, Edward Goldberg, John Larkindale, Audrey Rana, and Editor-in-Chief Rob Lakin. I'd like to thank Ross and Robin for the music that they have played on our arrival here tonight. We appreciate your willingness to play. Thank you very much. Tricia would like you to know how thrilled she is that this book has been completed. She and I agreed that there were many qualities that have guided the path towards tonight's launch. They include generosity, enthusiasm, modesty, determination, and inspiration. Generosity from the Embassy of Germany in responding positively to a request to co-host tonight's event. The Ambassador has provided the food and beverages for this evening's function. We thank you. Enthusiasm by the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. From the chair of the board, Deborah Hart, and the CEO, Chris Harris, to the hard-working staff based here in Wellington, Sarah Williams and Chris Clancy, who have co-hosted and handled much of the organisation for tonight. Modesty and determination, demonstrated by long-term Haas friend Rob Lakin, who has pulled together this wonderful book with all its complexities. He's going to tell you a little of the book's journey shortly. And above all, inspiration, shown by Tony, who sadly is no longer with us, but who would be delighted to know that this work has been finalised and is now available. And I think he'd quite like the party too. Tony's knowledge of his grandfather's contributions to the German political scene grew increasingly in his last few years. He was encouraged to explore the values and experience that made his grandfather Ludwig the inspiration that he was. Tony took these values into his own work in dealing with citizenship, education, and issues of diversity, particularly in his relationships with the peoples of the Pacific. And we greet Siahi and Tricia and Celia and Timothy and Afiaki Whanau Ainga, and we're very glad to have you among us. Tony's story was released several years ago, entitled Being Palangi. As he said in his chapter on the legacy of Ludwig Haas in this book we're looking at tonight, values such as advocacy for social justice that I learned from my grandfather's life have guided my own approach to public life in New Zealand. I'd like to invite Ambassador Kaurialiki to address you now. Thank you, Ambassador.
Tina koto, tina koto, tina koto katoa. Shalom. Good evening. Good evening to the co-hosts of this event, family and friends of Tony Haas, and the Holocaust Center of New Zealand, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to co-host this book launch tonight. My wife and I are very glad to be part of this important event. The book is about Ludwig Haas, who lived from 1875 to 1930, a German Jewish lawyer from Karlsruhe in southwest Germany, who became an important liberal politician in the 20s in Germany. The book is also about his family and his son Karl Haas, who immigrated to New Zealand in 1937. I don't hide that I have not heard or read about Ludwig Haas before having been involved in the preparation of tonight's event. But after having studied the content of the book, I discovered what an impressive German Jewish personality Ludwig Haas was. However, the biggest and very moving surprise was what I learned yesterday from Karlsruhe and what I would like to share with you at the end of my speech. The book we are presenting tonight is not a classic biography. It consists of 14 overlapping essays about the life and times of Ludwig Haas with documents and testimonies. The history of this book, the making of this book, is a history of its own and would merit its own lecture. I will just only mention that it was published in 2017 as the written outcome of a project jointly undertaken in Germany by the German Parliamentary Research Group and the Jewish Museum in Berlin, German language. It has now been translated into English, that's why we are here, with an additional chapter about the son of Ludwig Haas, Karl Haas. This English translation and edition was a project of Karl Haas' son, Ludwig Haas' grandson, Tony Haas. Tony Haas unfortunately cannot see this work to be completed because he passed away last year. I would like to particularly warmly greet Tony Haas' wife, Dr. Patricia Bonelli. The book's first chapters follow the political education and life of Ludwig Haas, starting with his beginnings as a law student and member of a Jewish fraternity, B'nai B'rith, and then his experiences as a local politician. These chapters are about his time in the German parliament, the Reichstag from 1912 to 1918, and again since 1919. He was a co-founder of the left liberal German Democratic Party. Later, until his death, he was the chairman of this small but very important political party. Just to name Theodor Heuss as another co-founder of this party, who later became the first president of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. These chapters are giving a very impressive and detailed picture of Jewish and liberal traditions in Germany. We learn about the background of liberal democratic principles, also in social policy and education. We learn about Ludwig Haas' participation in the Parliamentary Bern Conference of 1913, which tried to reconcile German and French animosities, which impressed me, especially because I'm married to a French wife, and Ludwig Haas' role as Minister of the Interior in his native Baden during the revolutionary period of 1918 and 1919. After 1919, we see Ludwig Haas as a dedicated Democrat in the Reichstag, working hard for a stable republic against right-wing and anti-Semitic enemies not only in the parliament. We learn about the growing anti-Semitism all through his lifetime, which he fought against as a German patriot, but which he, like many other liberals and Democrats, still may have underestimated for too long. The second part of the book tells the other, more private side of the story, about the children and wider family of Ludwig Haas before and mainly after the Nazi dictatorship. The many sufferings and achievements of the family all over the world would be enough material for another book. Ludwig Haas anticipated what led ahead and told his son, Karl Haas, to go as far away from home as he could. He did. Karl Haas, as a lawyer like his father, escaped Germany in 1933. In 1937, Karl Haas made it, not without difficulties, to New Zealand. And in the end, he became a sheep farmer some 60 kilometers north of Masterton in Pahiatua. My wife and I, probably like many of you, have already driven through Pahiatua several times, maybe many times, without knowing the Haas story. To sum up, the story of Ludwig Haas and his family is a fascinating, sad, but in some aspects also still optimistic story of German Jewish history in the last century, founded in a long tradition of democracy and humanity. That is why remembrance of Ludwig Haas is so important. Remembrance. One remembrance is the English translation of the book we are presenting tonight. Another remembrance was triggered these days in Karlsruhe by the preparation of this book launch. And this is the very moving surprise I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, which I now would like to share with you. During the preparation of tonight's event, the German embassy learned that since 2017, the city of Karlsruhe had been planning to name a street after Ludwig Haas. Therefore, a couple of weeks ago, we contacted Karlsruhe in order to know if maybe this project had already been carried out. We heard that this was not the case. A new unnamed street had indeed already been identified, but had not yet been named after Ludwig Haas. Earlier this week, we again contacted Karlsruhe. When in Karlsruhe, they understood that the book launch is for tonight. They decided not to wait any longer, but to carry out this project at once. Therefore, the very naming ceremony took place yesterday. Yesterday by the mayor of Karlsruhe. This morning, the city of Karlsruhe sent us some photos and a video of yesterday's naming and unveiling ceremony to allow us and you to see them tonight. I would therefore like to conclude my speech by showing you those photos and the video. You can see from that.
Also ich grüße ganz herzlich Wellington. Das ist der Lübbo Kramer, der ist Stadtrat bei uns im Gemeinderat und er hat mit seiner Wählervereinigung schwer dafür gesorgt, dass wir für Ludwig Haas jetzt endlich in Karlsruhe ein Namensschild bekommen. Das ist noch nicht ganz die offizielle Einweihung, weil dann würden hier noch ganz viel mehr Menschen drumherum stehen, trotz Corona. Aber es soll ein Gruß nach Wellington sein, dass wir es richtig ernst meinen. Wir freuen uns, dass über diesen bedeutenden badischen Politiker eine Lesung in Neuseeland stattfindet. Das zeigt die internationale Bedeutung. Das macht uns aber auch richtig glücklich. Und deswegen zeigen wir schon mal ganz stolz unser Straßenschild und grüßen herzlich.
I'd like to give you the translation. The mayor, Dr. Frank Metro, mayor of Karlsruhe, said, I send my best regards to Wellington. This is, he said, Lübbo Kramer, who is a city councillor here at the local city council. He and his voters association have worked hard to ensure that we finally get a street named after Ludwig Haas here in Karlsruhe. This is not quite the official inauguration because then there would be a lot more people standing around, despite Corona, but it should be a greeting to Wellington that shows our Karlsruhe's seriousness. We are happy, the mayor said, that a book presentation about this important politician from Baden is taking place in New Zealand. This shows the international importance, but it also makes us really happy. And that's why we proudly show our street sign and send our warmest regards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, and thank you to the people of Germany and the city of Karlsruhe for honouring Ludwig Haas. We would now like to invite Dr. Giacomo Lickner, who is the Associate Professor of History and Film at Victoria University and a member of the board of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, to speak to you about the relationship between the work of the Holocaust Centre and the publication of this text. Thank you, Dr.
Kia tō mai te aroha me te mana ki tanga o te atua. Tēnā koutou, I o koutou tini mate ko wehe ki te pō. Apiti hono, tātai ono, te honga mai ki te honga mai mate. Apiti hono, tātai ono, te honga ora ki te honga ora. E koa, te mana ki a koutou, ki ngā putahi urupatu o Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm delighted to welcome you all tonight again to the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, and I want to add firstly my welcome and my thanks to Tricia Haas and the Haas family for traveling here, being here with us today, and also my thanks to Susie, Isaacs and Nigel for helping us to organize this event. And I also want to acknowledge His Excellency Stefan Kravilitzky and Isabel for their support of this event, and more generally for the friendship and collaboration that you've shown to the Centre ever since arriving in Wellington. We really, really value it. November is a month that weighs heavy on the history of Europe and of Germany in particular. In this month we mark the end of World War I and the armistice at Compiègne, and we all know how central and symbolic a role that railway carriage at Compiègne ended up playing in post-war Nazi rhetoric. And also in November we remember the 1938 pogrom against German and Austrian Jews, commonly known as Kristallnacht. Some of you may have been at the concert we held for that a couple of weeks ago. But which happened on the 9th of November 1938, but on the same day, the 9th of November, 61 years later, is also the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And as Chancellor Angela Merkel noted recently, with customary gravitas and eloquence, these days tie together some of the darkest and brightest days in Germany's history. They also inextricably link the celebration of national unification to the tragic reminder of the dangers of nationalism. in the themes of nation, of patriotism, of civic duty, and the coexistence of layers of identity, Germanness, Jewishness, liberalism, republicanism, feature heavily in the essays of this beautiful tribute to Ludwig Haas. They paint a picture of a brave and committed man who stood by his beliefs in the coexistence of patriotism and democracy at a time when this was not only out of fashion, but also openly under threat and dangerous. As Ewald Grohe reminds us in the book, it is tempting and indeed common amongst historians to read the brief experience of the Weimar Republic only through the lens of its demise. So we interpret it through the fact that it failed, as it seems. That is of the rise of Nazism. I see parallels with how we think of the League of Nations, for instance. But if we abandon that historical determinism for a minute, Weimar can be restored as a bold and progressive experiment in the face of unsurmountable odds and deadly blows, some international, some domestic, and some undoubtedly also self-inflicted. Of all of those challenges, I've always thought that the deep fissures within the anti-fascist front were the most painful, because the most avoidable. There is much relevance and much inspiration in politicians like Haas, who, the book shows, consistently refuse to choose political expediency, populism, while working tirelessly for the cohesion of the democratic front. Our centres, the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand's work in Holocaust education encourages New Zealanders to learn more about the historical specificity of the Holocaust, and yet find within it relevance to their own lives and the challenges we all collectively face, including rising anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, but also more broadly, the rise of intolerance, of neo-fascism, and the constant struggle that we see globally between the efforts to broaden our definition of human rights and efforts instead to undermine it. It is perfectly fitting for the Centre to play a part in celebrating Ludwig Haas, therefore, as an upstander in a history shaped in part by the role of bystanders. Ludwig's courage, dignity, conviction seep through the pages of this book, but also eventually his foresight and the ultimate selflessness in encouraging his son to flee. And I think, Ambassador, we noticed the same moment. It's a very poignant moment. I can only imagine what it must have felt like for Ludwig after a life of service and proud Germanness to advise his son to leave behind the country of his birth and their roots, their Heimat. So as you said, go as far away from home. This doesn't say go as far away from Germany, it says go as far away from home. You can leave and you might have to run, but it's still home. We can only imagine, I say, but then again, too many people in this room are quite able to imagine those choices and that dislocation. And that takes Ludwig's story to New Zealand through Carl and Tony, and those memories and those silences, and the values transmitted from generation to generation, and so carefully brought to life by Rob Laking's work in the final part of the book, and through Tony's words as well. Migration and mobility, roots and new offshoots, and the work of tending to them. The Holocaust Centre exists because of stories like Ludwig's, like Carl's, and like Tony's. We recognize their importance and their universal relevance, and we are honored to help recognize them tonight. If you would like to know more about the work of the Centre, please do not hesitate to get in touch. If you would like to join the membership, there are membership forms around tonight. And until later, I'll just say Namihi Nui, Kia koutou.
Thank you so much, Jotham, for pulling those threads to our attention. And I would like to say that the Holocaust Centre is open tonight if anyone wants to go down and visit it, or who you haven't had a chance to previously. We've now got a little video clip from someone who was very involved in this project from the outset. He will explain why. It's from Aubrey Pomerantz, who is the chief archivist at the Jewish Museum in Berlin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My name is Aubrey Pomerantz. I'm the head of the archives of the Jewish Museum Berlin. I'm very grateful to Rob Laking for inviting me to make some brief remarks on the occasion of the launch of the English edition of the book about Ludwig Haas that I co-edited with Ewald Grothe, Director of the Archive of Liberalism of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and Andreas Schulz, General Secretary of the Commission for the History of Parliamentarianism and Political Parties. Needless to say, we are delighted that an English edition of the volume has been published, and we wish to thank Rob and his team of translators for taking on the project and to congratulate them for their achievement. The book examines all aspects of Ludwig Haas' life and work, from his years as a student and young lawyer in Karlsruhe, the beginnings of his political career there, and as a member of the Reichstag in Imperial Germany, as a pioneer of the Free State of Baden and subsequent decade, as a representative and leader of the German Democratic Party during the Weimar Republic, as well as his involvement in the First World War and his fight against anti-Semitism. The volume also includes essays on left liberalism in the Weimar Republic, the emigration of left liberals after 1933, and the German emigration to New Zealand. The second focus of the book, albeit with fewer contributions, is on the history of the Haas family, on Ludwig Haas' sister Marie Schloss, and on Ludwig's legacy. And the English book includes a most welcome edition on the life of Ludwig's son, Karl. Both editions, the English and the German, were initiated by Ludwig's grandson, Tony, who I'm sure almost all of you knew. And I would like to say a few words about my relationship to him and about the development of the book. Tony and I were introduced to each other via email in 2012 by Ken Gorby, the former project director of the Jewish Museum Berlin, who I had the pleasure of working with here for a couple of years, and who, of course, is a household name in New Zealand. 1 year later, Tony visited me at the museum, having previously spoken with representatives from the city of Karlsruhe and with Andreas Schulz, who I mentioned previously. Tony told me of the still nascent project to pen a book about his grandfather Ludwig Haas. His power of persuasion, emphasized in the preface of the English edition, were not lost on me, and I too became involved in the project, though only somewhat later. I first had the pleasure of visiting Tony in Greytown in December 2014, and his niece Craigie in Wellington, who showed me the wonderful collection of materials the family had pertaining to Ludwig Haas. Some 5 months later, the collection arrived at the Jewish Museum Berlin in the form of a permanent loan, and it proved an essential source for many of the contributions to the book. In June of 2016, we held a public symposium on Ludwig Haas here at the museum. And 1 year later, at the end of May 2017, the German edition of the book was launched in Karlsruhe. To our great regret, Tony was unable to attend either event, but he did receive detailed reports from family and friends who were able to come. Tony was delighted that the book project came to fruition, and even before its publication, had embarked on getting it translated into English, an undertaking that has now been successfully completed. I was very moved to learn from Rob that Tony was able to see the completed manuscript before his passing. I am very thankful that Tony did know that a street in Karlsruhe was named after his grandfather Ludwig Haas upon the initiative of myself and my co-editors. Ludwig Haas continues to have a strong presence at the Jewish Museum Berlin. A photograph of him from the First World War with his Iron Cross First Class is on display in our new core exhibition that opened 3 months ago. And my own interest has certainly not waned. Just 6 weeks ago, I made a remarkable find on eBay and purchased a bronze commemorative memorial plaque of Ludwig Haas made in 1931 by the German Jewish sculptor Jakob Plesner that I am happy to show you. I would have loved to have been with you this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you a wonderful event and may the English edition of the book find many, many readers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aubrey. Across the waves. And lastly, Rob Lake. I mentioned modesty as being one of the qualities uppermost in the completion of this book. Rob has had eminent careers as a senior government advisor and academic. However, his determination to see this project commence several years ago with encouragement from Tony has been outstanding. Rob will now tell you a little of this.
Susan, Mr. Ambassador, Dr. Victor, and a lot of friends here. It's really, sometimes through the fog of age, it's difficult to recognize, and I hope I haven't snubbed anybody, but I see many, many familiar faces here. It's a great pleasure. Winston Churchill is supposed to have said about Clement Attlee, he is a modest man. He has a lot to be modest about. Well, I have a lot to be modest about. This book is the creation of the authors of the original essays in the German edition. The English translation was conceived by Tony and carried out by our 5 translators. Barbara Harris and George Troop can't be here tonight, unfortunately, but I'm going to ask our other 3 to stand up and take a bow. Bertram, Eddie, and John. Where's John? Barbara has helped in the heavy lifting. She actually did a complete translation of the first of the manuscript, and then Eddie and John and George did the review translations. And they're the real heroes of this. All of us, I think, learned a lot about German as a language. I began to learn something about it, and also about German history. The book is both to remember Ludwig Haas as a significant figure in German political life and as a history of his family. And I think you put them together, they will ensure that Ludwig and his life and times are not forgotten, available for our descendants to make of them what they can. The essays that cover Ludwig's public life are a political statement in themselves, I should say. They exemplify the intent of the German government, particularly through the Bundestag project, and German historians and the people of Germany to ensure that none of modern German history remains in the shadows. It needs to be set down, and I think that's the common conviction of all the people who are associated with this book. With respect to the time of Weimar, from 1919 to 33, this has not always been the case. As the German editors say, for a long time, few of the politicians in the newly formed parties of the Bonn democracy wanted to be reminded of those who held political responsibility during the death throes of the Republic. German politicians and historians at the time placed a large part of the blame on the fragmented and factionalized nature of the Reichstag politics during this period, which put the country very much at risk to authoritarian rule. Now I think the generation of German historians represented in this book have a more complex view of why Weimar failed. And this is thanks to their scholarship, those who have contributed to this book. A little bit about Ludwig's life, maybe repeating what's been said. He was born in 1875, which is, remember, 25 years after the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the crowning of Wilhelm I as the first Emperor of Germany and the appointment of Bismarck as Chancellor. In his lifetime, in Ludwig's lifetime, Germany emerged as a unified nation and a major political and economic power, established its own colonial empire, fought 2 major European wars, drew the world into the first global conflict of the 20th century, and began the descent into the darkness of the Nazi era. One of the difficulties for us as editors and translators begins with the importance of the underlying social, political, and economic history of these enormous changes for a proper understanding of the text. German historians writing in German for German readership will take much of this understanding for granted. We faced the translator's fundamental problem that many of the terms which carry meaning for first language readers are unexplained, taken for granted. We have written footnotes to explain some of these terms, but in the end, as we say in the preface, we hope that this book encourages readers to go back to other texts of German history to get more of the context. I think actually the historians, the original historians, will be horrified at the extent to which we relied on Wikipedia for comments. But I think the number one controversial is Wikipedia. We did check the sources that the writers of those had written. The essays in the book span the various phases of his public life, and there's no need for me to go over those again. And just to repeat, the book is, as Dr. Lichter said, a collection of essays rather than a single narrative, and the themes emerge from these essays collectively. With due humility, and I recognize where I stand, and that many of the people in this room will have intimate family reasons for a much deeper knowledge of this history than I do. I wanted briefly to discuss 3 of them. I can't see the pictures, Nigel, but I hope the one that's up there is Ludwig. Incidentally, the first one, the one of him with that dashing hat, I can see why Josephina fell in love with him. He looks pretty dishy, penetrating eyes. This one is as an election candidate. So the first issue really is the social basis of democracy. It seems particularly pertinent right now to ask again how the legitimacy of a system of government is sustained. And Weimar offers us no assurances that it can be. In the brief period of Weimar, and in even longer periods when you take things for granted, democracy is always at risk, I think. In 1926, Ludwig could say that, quote, "It should be gratefully acknowledged today across party lines that the Weimar Constitution saved the German state and with it the unity of the greater part of the German nation. The Constitution was indeed an idealistic document. It was founded on Enlightenment principles with a strong framework of human rights. Now Weimar is seen as an object lesson in the failure of a young democracy and of the liberal principles, representative democracy, individual rights, and equality that underpinned it." Some of this had to do with the provisions of the Weimar Constitution itself. The proportional representation system, and we have inherited in New Zealand a modified version of it, which I think in the basic law attempted to correct some of the deficiencies of that system as it applied in Weimar, permitted very small splinter parties which encouraged unstable and shifting coalitions. And the second failing, universally recognized, was that it could not make up its mind whether it was parliamentary or presidential system, and the power of the president to appoint a chancellor and rule by decree in an emergency was what enabled Hitler to legally seize control of the government. Ludwig himself initially supported that proposal, but rapidly realized that in the presence of Hindenburg, he was faced with somebody who was prone to tantrums and would invoke these powers frequently, and he grew pretty exasperated with it. The two of these, the proportional representation and the power of decree, went together. Many historians argued then that the inability of social democrats and liberals to form a stable coalition and government was what led to the reversion to autocratic rule. But I think the essays in this book suggest a more fundamental cause. the principles of liberal democracy failed to be embedded in the public consciousness. Many of the older elements of German society were implacably hostile to the idea of the republic. It took me for a while, for example, I kept reading these stories about the arguments about the flags. The black, white, and red flag on the one hand, and the black, red, and gold flag on the other, until I realized that the black, white, and red flag was a symbol of Imperial Germany. It represented the Kaiser, in fact. And there were constant attempts to somehow introduce it into the official flags of the new republic. It was iconic for the monarchists. When we think about that, we might well think about the current debates about the symbology of the Confederate flag in the United States. It was a signal, really. Elements in the army, the courts, the civil service, the upper landowners in the East, the large corporations were all also opposed to the republic. Class structure or religion still dominated much of politics. Liberalism itself was divided between an older conservative national liberal party, partial to the monarchy, and a strongly centralized rule, and a newer left liberal movement, which Ludwig espoused, with progressive views for social justice, which sought an opening to the left with the Social Democrats, and which was therefore open to coalition with them. In the end, the Weimar experience posed the question of whether a democracy can survive if it is torn apart by competing social forces, where the people of a state cannot agree on what unites them as citizens. Second theme is the relationship between citizen and culture, something which was a dominant theme in Ludwig's life. And the picture there should be of Ludwig in his student couleur, the colors of his fraternity, which was one of the first Jewish fraternities, in this case at Heidelberg University, but anyway. And to me it symbolizes the problems of Jewish identity in the late 19th, early 20th century Germany, when Ludwig was growing to adulthood. He's pictured here in those colors. Bavaria was relatively new, along with the others, and created because Jewish students were excluded from the other fraternities at German universities, which were rife with nationalistic and anti-Semitic sentiment. So the Jewish fraternities copied the rituals of their Christian equivalents. The couleur, the coats of arms, the mottos, songs, the meetings in local pubs and getting drunk, and most strange to us of all, the mensur, which was academic fencing. There was serious stuff with razor-sharp sabers. And when you see those pictures of Prussian officers with dueling scars, it was probably something they acquired in the course of a mensur combat. And in the book, you'll see a particularly gory image of somebody in Bavaria having his saber cut attended to. The point being that, in fact, to the greatest extent possible, the Jewish fraternities did copy these symbols and rituals. Ludwig saw them as fostering ideals of personal honor and courage, as well as conviviality. He got roaring drunk at least once at one of the beer hall meetings. In another episode, he's lauded for having convened a beer competition and then addressing the results in several hours, the text says, of Homeric hexameters. So I think most of them would have been asleep. So he was a strong supporter of the Jewish student fraternity, both at his own university and nationally. He was he specifically saw the fraternities as a way of strengthening Jewish identity and sense of self-worth amongst Jewish students and understanding of Jewish traditions. In a speech to the National Association, he said, "Your history you should know, and your history you should love, and traditions you should keep, because if you are without tradition, you are rootless and adrift." But in the same speech, he emphasized his faith in Germany as his homeland. We believe in our fatherland, and we acknowledge this as our fatherland, and we see a bright future only in this country. So the next picture, Nigel, is, if you can't see it, is Ludwig in full dress uniform, proudly displaying his Iron Cross First Class. This was taken at the time that he had been seconded to the Army administration governing Warsaw. And it symbolizes, I think, that he was a committed German patriot and ready to go to war for his country. He did a year of volunteer service while at university, and when war came, he was ready to enlist. He was in the trenches at Ypres in 1914-15, where he saw action mainly against French troops, but there's a possibility he was at least within gunshot of New Zealanders there. In fact, Trish's father was in Fort, Joe Fort, is that right? Yeah. So it's a possibility that they were in opposing trenches. On active service, he earned a battlefield commission, which was very rare for Jewish soldiers, and the Iron Cross First Class, equally rare, before being posted to Warsaw, as I said. He had no doubts about the justice of the German cause in World War I. He blamed the war on the Russians and said, never before has there been an army of higher culture in the field than this German army. After the war, he persistently took up the cause of the army and of the conditions of ordinary soldiers in service. He strongly opposed the term of the peace settlement imposed at Versailles. He didn't agree with the backstabbing theory that the Social Democrats had caved in and negotiated peace when the war could have been won, which was a popular theory among some of the German army. But he strongly opposed the terms of the peace settlement imposed at Versailles. Yet, I think even with the honors from his military service and the high regard in which he was held by many officers because of his advocacy for the army, he was aware of the contested place of German Jews. He had to fight for promotions that came much more readily to others. One of the few times when he spoke out on an issue affecting Jewish service in the army was the infamous Jewish census of army service, instituted because of the falsehood that German Jews had shirked from such service. When he was proposed as Minister of Defense by his party, he turned it down, explicitly because he believed that a Jew would never be acceptable in that position. He said elsewhere, the German Jews will have to be clear that ancient prejudices have not suddenly and completely disappeared in the course of this war. Nevertheless, he was optimistic that with social and economic progress, anti-Semitism would progressively disappear. Now we can see that optimism was horribly misplaced, but was the cause for it in the first decades of the 20th century. The next picture is of his dad, Julius Haas. The picture, very epitome of a respectable German Bürgerlich, a prosperous wine merchant, and in fact, Ludwig came on both sides from a tradition of the prosperous middle class. Heidi Gimbitsky-Axnick's essay on the family history is well worth reading for the way it threads through this story of the position of middle-class established Jews in German society, really from the 18th century right through to the 1930s. It details the restrictions dating from medieval times placed on Jews' occupations, residence and rights of travel, and their progressive relaxation for the 18th century. Jews were granted citizenship rights in Baden for the first time in 1862. The equal rights guaranteed by the Reichsconstitution had enabled middle-class urban Jews to prosper in business and the professions and play an active role in local and national public life and politics. we can see this to the extent and the range of Ludwig's political contacts in Karlsruhe and Berlin, and the sort of people who came for dinner at the house in Strasse in Karlsruhe. Some of the most important local and regional political figures, national figures of all political persuasions. And the essay that was written by Barbara Wöhlbrunn on Ludwig's sister, Maria, really is a fascinating study of a modern progressive woman and what she could accomplish. She entered vigorously into public life as a suffragette. You could say she was a pro-feminist, she was a social activist and researcher, and she was a member of the Baden state legislature. So it was possible for Jews, middle-class established Jews like Ludwig and Maria to find a place in public life in their milieu, possibly particularly in Baden at the time. But it was obvious still that to be Jewish was to be singled out, placed in a special category in public life. And there was and the underlying strain of hostility and suspicion was still there. There were anti-Jewish riots in 1848 and outbursts of Jew-baiting and violence in the 1880s. Social hostility to Jews increased with the influx of Ostjuden, Eastern Jews, and then washed back on the older established Jewish families. Race theory emerged as part of the Völkisch nationalist movement to classify Jews as alien to Germans. Ludwig's faith in progress must have been severely shaken by the assassination of Walter Rathenau, the Reich Foreign Minister, a friend of his, in 1922. And we know from Karl's testimony, as a couple of other people have said, that towards the end of his life he was expressing his foreboding to his son. And it was only 3 years after his death that Karl himself, while at Heidelberg, realized that he had no future like his father's in Germany. So the third theme is really what can we learn from this history. One of the problems of history is that we always see it through the lens of today. Part of the problem for us, I'm preaching, I know, to some historians that I know, so forgive me for this kind of childish intervention in your discipline. But for me, particularly, part of the problem is understanding what happened from the perspective of the time. It's one of the dramatic ironies of history that we know what's coming. We're children of our times, and from the perspectives of 2020, we can see what seems to be the inevitable outcome of the events of 1930. My generation, not in as direct a way quite often as many of the people here, has grown up haunted by the horrors of the next decade and a half of German history, which so deeply cut into the lives of the families of many of the people here, their ancestors. The issue of the place of Germans who are also Jewish is therefore perhaps the hardest for us to see from Ludwig's perspective of nearly a century ago. But it did seem clear that towards the end of his life he had a premonition that life for his family was soon to become a lot more difficult and dangerous. So it raises the inevitable hypotheticals. Who knows if Ludwig had survived his stroke and his heart attack and had not died in 1930, who knows what or when he himself would have decided to leave with Josephina. Karl himself believed that Ludwig might well have decided to stay on to continue the fight to protect the republic that embodied his ideals for a just society. We only have the record of so many of his friends and colleagues, political colleagues, who could soon no longer have any influence on the terrible path into darkness of Germany in the 30s and decided to continue the struggle in exile. It impressed me, in fact, how few of them ever went back they became part of the diaspora. The Germany, the ambassador could correct me on this, but the Germany of the post-war period was probably created by a different group from the left liberals who left, with exceptions like Theodore Hartweiss and so on. But a lot of them, you read in the biographies, they say, if Ludwig had left in time, would he have come back to Germany after the war and helped to rebuild the robust, modern democracy of today? Well, we won't know. So the next picture, you may not be able to see it, is of Karl in a snappy-looking bowler hat, looking as pleased with himself as a cat eating the cream with Amelia, who's looking equally pleased on their wedding day. And I want to say about this photo that it was taken by a young refugee from Berlin, age 21, by the name of Hannah Eccles. And her daughter is here today. Sonia, thank you for giving us the authority to use this photo. Other Easterbrook Smith should be taken. And the point is that yet at a terrible cost, at a dreadful cost, Germany and the world nevertheless emerged from that dark decade after Weimar. My generation and my grandson's German cousins, my oldest son married a girl from Jüdisch, right on the west of Germany, have been fortunate to grow up in stable liberal societies which are tolerant of diversity. I'm not an historian, because I may well have made clear, and as a student, I never understood the value of history. Its only value, I thought, was that it could help us predict the future, and it seemed too messy and full of contradictions for that. Now I think that history might help us understand what we are now and the role that our ancestors played. What did Ludwig leave behind him? One of the most touching parts of Tony's legacy is his intense excitement when he discovered that his grandfather held the same views about liberal democracy and tolerance and diversity that he did. But the clear message of Weimar is that we cannot take those liberal values for granted. We have to fight to protect them. And I wanted to finish. The final photo is of Ludwig, also with that rather snappy-looking fedora on his knee, along with his wife. And he seems to be smoking a cigarette in a holder as well on his wedding. So thank you very much. It's been a real privilege to be associated with this project.
Thank you, Rob. That was a wonderful journey through the story. We've reached the end of this evening's program. Other than eating, drinking, listening to music from our Young Pacific family, there are a few thank yous that I think we want to make. And I'm going to start with our musicians, Ross and Robert. Like this, thank you very much. Above all, Tricia. We love you, and we're so happy. Rob, thank you so much. Whenever I've been on the point of sending an email, in came one beforehand with the same suggestion.
I just have to say I concur with your decision.
Well trained. To the ambassador. Thank you so much.
12.